Hello, welcome back to History of Wine and the Vine. I'm Emily Kate. So today's topic is the relationship between the history of wine and religion. So I want to preface this whole discussion with the fact that when historians look at religious documents, we look at them simply as texts, as we would with any other document. So they're looked at in a completely academic way, and there's kind of absolutely no religious bias or religious kind of commentary that goes on. It's looked at simply as another book. So that being said, let's get started. I kind of broke things up today into three different categories. So we have personal consumption, what religion tells us about kind of how to consume alcohol, what relationship we should have with wine. Then we have kind of rituals, sacrifices, these kinds of really juicy things that happened in the ancient time. And then we have a quick discussion after about gods, so gods of wine. We're going to kind of be spanning a lot of different religions. We're going to be talking about Judaism and Christianity first, and then we'll move our discussion to kind of these divine cults that were around. There's one from the Pharaohic era that we're going to be talking about, so we'll get to that later. So let's get started on the personal consumption. So personal consumption of wine. Christianity is what we'll talk about first. Now there's this amazing source that's called Traditio, and it was written in 1384 by a guy named Gracia. And what's happening here is there are a lot of treatises around 1384. There were a lot of treatises, but they were quite lofty in what they asked, and a lot of times didn't have the practicality that this one had, which is why I chose this one to look at. This was a very down-to-earth, here are the kind of decisions that you'll be faced with, and here's how to deal with them, a very kind of simple thing, as opposed to this kind of ascetic mysticism and kind of morality treatises that were also floating around at the time. This was kind of the doable one. So this was the one that you could jive with. So I'm first going to read you a quote, and it's from Traditio. So this quote is about drunkenness, and it says, "Spiritually, it destroys in him any common sense and virtue, forcing him to err, disturbing his conscience, and making him commit adultery and homicide." So that's a laundry list of horrible things that you can do, and they're all attributed to drunkenness. Someone can get a really bad view of how they looked at wine if they just looked at that one statement. But let's keep in mind, this isn't the attitude on wine, this is the attitude on drunkenness. So now, for comparative purposes, I'm going to read you just something about wine. So, the man who drinks with measure has nothing to fear because God created wine as a source of health. So that's pretty different. One, healthy. Beverage, healthy, drunkenness, adultery, and homicide. So we're kind of isolating this idea of if you drink in moderation and if you kind of aren't gluttonous, that you'll pretty much be okay. That wine is okay. Now, something that I think is great, and this is exactly what I was talking about how this is like the practical treatise and it's fantastic, is that it actually prescribed to you, it gave you an idea of how much wine you should drink. So it explained. So in 1384, they were still having dinner and supper. I think that's a thing that people still do in some places in the States. It's a great idea. So at dinner, you were allowed to have 3 cups of wine, and at supper, you were allowed to have 2. There's also a place that says that you're not really supposed to have any more than 4 cups at any given time, and these cups should be mixed with water. Now, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I think that it's interesting, and you'll find out why when we talk about in the Talmud what it says, in order to kind of temper the effects of alcohol. So remember that they wanted you to kind of mix it with water. And then we'll talk about the Bible and how the Bible kind of dealt with wine. So I have a quote for you. And it says, "Drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with spirit." So first, obviously, we have the same kind of view. Temperance, don't be gluttonous, don't kind of drink to excess because bad things will happen to you. Okay, solid advice, that's fine. And then, you know, I never know who's watching, but if there's any medieval historians out there that like these, you'll know about kind of, but I'll explain to the rest of you, hello, about the idea of being filled with spirit. So I'll admit, the first time I read it like, don't drink wine, drink spirits. It is not that. I need to put on my historian hat. It's being filled with the spirit. So kind of, there was this idea in medieval times that really meshed together these things that right now, today, we think of as very like not together. So kind of love and sexual love and drunkenness and religion. And they were kind of joined. And this Song of Songs kind of whole thing about having these strong feelings, these strong states of being in pain, being in love, these things, and having them with religion was pretty popular. So I think that that's kind of like a loaded statement, and it'd be fun to unpack, but not in this video. And then next, let's move on to Judaism and how Judaism kind of looks at the relationship between wine and religion. So I looked at the Talmud, and this is a quote from Maimonides. When a wise man drinks wine, he drinks only enough to accompany the food in his innards. Anyone who becomes drunk is a sinner, disgraced, and loses his wisdom. It is forbidden to drink in the afternoon, even a small amount, except as a part of a meal, as a drink which accompanies a meal does not intoxicate. Thus, scholars are careful to refrain from wine after the meal. Okay, this was why I was so fascinated that in the Christian text that they told you to mix the wine and the water, and now here in this Jewish text they're saying eat food first and then drink, and then you won't. So it's all about tempering the effects of the alcohol. Wine isn't the problem. It's the effects that are the problem. It's the drunkenness that's the problem. So this whole idea of wanting to only drink at meals, so now all of a sudden we're kind of limiting the time that you can drink. We're limiting the amount you can drink. So if you'll notice, it said that it should kind of be proportional to how much food that you're having. You should only kind of like wet what's in your innards, so to speak. And this is good advice. This is fine advice. And it's kind of interesting because now let's switch over to talking about the kind of sacrifice rituals, funerary offerings, and divine offerings of all kinds of fun things. I looked at, and this is a continuation, I looked at two kind of different divine cult case studies, if you will. So one was in Egypt in the Pharaohic period, and then another one was in Israel. Now what I find so interesting about the one in Israel is that we just heard in this Jewish text that how much wine you drink should be proportional to how much food you eat. And then in this divine offering, you know, I could read it for you. I have it here, but it's a lot of like old-timey measurements and things, and I think I'll just explain it. So let's say that you're offering a bowl, which is what the example is. It's depending on how big the bowl is, which is how much wine that you also offer. So either you spill out or you know, however you're doing it. And so I think this is really interesting because these two groups are geographically right near each other, and they kind of have this idea of the food and the wine being in proportion and kind of growing together or diminishing together. And I think that's like, when I found that out, I thought it was really cool. I hope you think it's cool too. Now we'll just switch over to the discussion of the Pharaohic era divine cults in Egypt. So in Egypt, if you watch the ancient Egypt video, which you have to go do after this video, go do it. You'll learn about the wine god Shesmu. So the wine press god, Shesmu. Now Shesmu was not only the wine press god, but also the god of destruction, and has a lot of images of like human heads in a wine press being squeezed and juice coming. Serious stuff. So there was also a wine god for the ancient Egyptian cult. And this was, well, for the ancient Egyptians, and this was Osiris. So Osiris was not only the wine god, but also someone who decided the fate of the dead. So you have this kind of like god of the underworld, and then wine god in one, and then god of destruction, and the wine press god in one. So these kind of things being so linked is very interesting to me, because we have a lot of this. So Osiris, there was this huge festival right before the Nile flooded, and even though Osiris was this god of death, they would kind of like drink to Osiris and drink to this wine god. And nowadays, I mean, at least in New York, we think of floods as bad things. This was a good thing. This meant kind of abundance, and this inundation of water kind of meant like great things in ancient Egypt, and they wanted the Nile to flood. And so they would drink to this god, and they had all these different funerary offerings, and you will see more about that if you have watched the ancient Egypt video. That's not the point here. But what I think is interesting is this kind of duality that you have. And moving on to Bacchus, Dionysus. So if you'll remember, Bacchus was the Roman version of Dionysus, the Greek god. This god was mercurial, which, if you'll remember your SAT vocab, which I hope you all do, just kind of like quick to change emotion, quick to change states. So you had this god that could be very kind of chilled and relaxed and, oh, everything's fine, or you could have this crazy, insane god that was angry and vengeful and bitter and all these things. So this duality is present in everything that religion says about wine. Everything. So you have, let's just go on an overarching kind of tour here of what we just talked about. So first you have traditio, which tells you that God made wine, it's a healthy drink, it's great, but if you have too much of it, adultery and homicide and all kinds of things. Then you have in the Talmud with Maimonides, who says, yeah, wine is great, have it with your friends at dinner, but if you have too much, you lose your wisdom, you lose everything like this. There's this very kind of boom, drop, that wine is great, but too much of it, not good. Then you have these funerary rites that say, oh, it's fine, but only as much as you eat, or as you offer, as you sacrifice. And then you have Osiris and Shesmu and Bacchus and Dionysus, who are these kind of duality filled figures that can either be just your best friend or your worst enemy. So these mirror this saying of that you need moderation in your wine drinking, that wine can either be the best thing or the worst thing, and it all depends on kind of how you approach it. So we have the tempering ideas of mixing it with water, having it with food, and I guess the gist is moderation is key. So I hope that this was kind of a fun lecture for you guys, and it got you thinking about how you approach wine and how your religion approaches wine. And yeah, I'll see you next week. Cheers!